guess we can start, Gautam.
So let me welcome all of you to this. As some of you may know, those of you here who've been here for some years, in about November of each year, the RDO, the Research and Development Office, organizes a set of talks around the Nobel Prizes for that year. And this year is special because Professor Ashwini Deshpande will speak about the Economics Nobel Prize in an area that is close to her own interests, as well as the interests of many in the department. Professor Deshpande needs no introduction to all of you. But for the benefit of the people who are online, I will mention that she's a professor of economics at Ashoka University. She spent many years at the Delhi School of Economics. She is an expert in caste and gender and its impact on economic activity. Ashwini, go ahead.
Thank you, Gautam, and thank you for this series, actually, which is really a great initiative. So let me jump actually right into why the prize to Claudia Goldin is significant. What I've tried to do is, I mean, she, as would be expected from a Nobel Prize winner, she has a vast range of publications, and it's not possible to go into all of them. But I focused on ones that I think are more significant, and also my personal favorites in terms of, her work. And it also gives a sweep of her ideas from where she started to where, her latest book, which is Career and Family. So I'm going to take you a little bit through that journey. Something can go wrong with technology, it will. So we have to wait for it. कैसे किया आपने? Okay. So Claudia Goldin's prize is highly significant because for two reasons. One is that she's only the third woman to have won Nobel Prize in Economics out of a total of 93 laureates for 55 prizes. And she's also only the third economic historian to have won it. So it shows you, that within the field of economics, economic history, and certainly women's work in the field of academic economics is not considered, path-breaking enough. But of course, that situation is hopefully changing now with two Nobel laureates within a recent, with a very short gap. It's also significant that she's the only one prize holder this time, that she's not sharing it with any other laureate. So I think that's good because it highlights puts into salience her work. I'm going to begin with a book that she had written in 1994 called Understanding the Gender Gap, an economic history of American women. And there are several papers that were written before or around this time that found their way into the book, essentially. Why is this book important? Is because her ability to look at a phenomenon in a historical perspective helped her to uncover facts that other economists had missed because they were looking at a very short period of time. So overall, earlier research, by the way, Goldin's work is exclusively with US women. So all the data that I'm referring to is about the United States. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about how those results could be generalized, or what are the lessons for those of us who are not living in the United States. So the earlier research was unanimous in the view that in the 20th century, women's labor force participation rates increased with economic growth. So economic growth was seen as a big driver for pushing up women's labor force participation rates. Goldin went back 200 years, including the 20th century. So she looked at a much wider span, and she uncovered, which is what is now called the famous U-shaped curve. And she showed that actually women's labor force participation rate was higher in the pre-industrialization period. It dipped with industrialization. And then after industrialization, as the economy transitioned towards the service sector, it started to pick up again. So because people were only looking at the period from, say, 1940s, 50s onwards, All they could see was the rising part of the U that you see in the picture. But the true relationship, actually, what she argued, was a U-shaped relationship, not really a linear relationship with economic growth. And this U shape has been now used to explain the pattern of women's labor force participation rate in across countries as well, about which there's a little bit of this debate and discussion about whether the U shape characterizes all countries in transition. However, that's a wider debate. But what this sort of discovery of the U shape showed the importance of history in looking at current outcomes. So the longer the time span that you observe, what you can see is patterns were not always what we see today. You go back in history and you see a very different pattern compared to what you saw today. So her work from, for example, from the 1940s, 1950s, etc., where post-World War II is the real period where US female labor force participation rates really increased. So it's what we think of today as a big difference in labor force participation rates of the United States versus a country like India. Actually, it's only in the 1950s. It's pretty recent that the labor force participation rates started to increase. And there are factors that she has analyzed through several papers, namely the impact of education, the impact of the contraceptive a pill, on which she has an excellent paper, and what that did to women's and men's expectations and how that changed family and career. And I'll take you through some of that journey in subsequent slides. So as I said, the most striking increase in married women's labor force participation rate in the United States happened post-World War II, right? Not before that. Before that, you see an increase in unmarried women's participation rates, but marriage was much more common then. So, you really need to focus also on married women's labor force participation rate. But while the increase happened post-1950, many of the preconditions that are needed for women to enter the labor force had happened actually earlier. So, for example, women's education had been increasing continuously, fertility had been declining, and most importantly, demand for female labor in clerical and sales sector increased, which is what contributed to an increase in female labor force participation rates. In India today, we are grappling with this issue, and the entire focus is on norms change. But and by the way, we have a lot of these preconditions already. Women's education levels are rapidly increasing. The gap between male and female education levels has shrunk even at the highest levels of education. Fertility has gone down, maternal mortality rate has gone down. So many of these preconditions exist. What does not exist is an increase in the demand for female labor, which is what you see in the United States as being one of the many components that led to an increase in female labor force participation rate. So while female labor force participation rate increased, but between 1900 and 1970, so for a very long period of time, occupational segregation continued. So it's a mixed picture. There's good news in that more women are getting into paid work, but what are considered male jobs versus what are considered female jobs, that distinction continued to exist. And to a large extent, that was a cause of the male-female earnings gap as well, because men were disproportionately represented in the higher paying occupations, and women were disproportionately represented in the lower paying occupations. So you see occupational segregation, which is practically unchanged between 1900 and 1970, which is pretty remarkable. And not, that's again, Goldin's contribution that she brought that out with data. And this is a quotation that I really like from this book, the 1994 book, which she says, increased participation of women over the long run resulted more from a changed nature of jobs, such as decrease in hours of work and rise of white-collar work, than from shifts in social norms and attitudes. I cannot emphasize the importance of this one statement when we think of debates in India, for example, where the entire, more or less the entire academic establishment, the multilateral agencies, the UN system, the World Bank, et cetera, are focusing only on social norms and what can change social norms in order to increase female labor force participation rates. But what this tells us, and this is, by the way, not unique to the United States, we've seen that in other countries as well, which is that you need to change the material conditions first before norms start to change. And what this shows is that work that was not manually arduous, that did not require a lot of manual strength, physical strength, etc., when those opportunities became available and the demand for female labor increased in those sectors, aided by the fact that women were now more educated, all of that then contributed to increased labor force participation rates. And the norm shifts and all happened later, not before, right? And so I think this is a very important point, a lesson from Goldin's work that we need to keep in mind when we talk about India. Okay, so she, talks, so we now know that from Second World War onwards, women's participation rates increased. In 1963, she says, there were college-educated women in the US who maybe were not working outside the home because of childcare responsibilities, domestic responsibilities. And they, what they used to say was, okay, we have a problem, but we don't know what the name of that problem is. So it's a problem that has no name, because yes, there are jobs. And if we wanted, we could also go out and work, but it's difficult, it's hard, right? Because you have to take care of children, etc. So it was used to be called the problem with no name. What is the actual problem that is preventing these women from going out and working? Okay, so that picture has radically changed now. So now coming to 2023, 2022, which is the data that she uses in her latest book, which she wrote during COVID, she shows that the participation rates of US women have increased, married, unmarried, all categories. Female college graduates, because that book is more focused on college educated women. So these are highly educated women. So female college educated women are on career track. It's not just about labor force participation. It's not that you get out and just earn you take up a job and earn a living. Basically, you're thinking of your career. You're thinking of a career path. So now women are not just thinking of their families, but they're actually thinking of their careers. However, women who are on a career find that their earnings and their promotions are worse compared to their male peers who are just as well educated, or the education gaps between their male peers and them is not high. However, the earnings gap and the onward trajectory, mobility within jobs, women continue to feel shortchanged. And it is this paradox, it is this puzzle that Goldin has examined in her latest book, where she, where I'm going to refer to some of her earlier work as well, because that's important. So the point is, a lot has changed between 1950s, 60s to now, yet women continue to feel shortchanged. So what is the problem now? What's going wrong now, right? So that's the question that she's asking. So is this also a problem with no name, as it used to be earlier, she asks? She says, well, actually, there are many names that you see in the literature, and there's a lot of work, and including her own work, on many of these names. So she, sex discrimination, which is for similar types of work, women will earn a wage that's lower than men, and so on. So that's just sex discrimination in wages. There can be occupational segregation also, to a certain extent. Okay, there is a gender bias, that when employers are considering whether to hire a man or a woman, they might consider hire a man because they just find might be easier. It's already men are, in the establishment, they don't have to make changes. They don't have to provide for maternity leave, all kinds of things. So there's a gender bias in hiring, which is fairly well established. There's also a glass ceiling, which is, it's okay to hire women up to a point, but when you think of leadership positions, women are less likely to be considered for that. There is a term that she uses a lot, which is mommy track, and that's really what I'm going to focus on. And so she says, at one level, the problem has many names now. And so, we can identify each of them. But what she points out, and so basically she says that when you hear analysis of this problem in the literature, oftentimes women are told that, well, it's your problem. I mean, the reason that you're not getting advanced enough, or you're not earning enough, is the problem is of your own doing. You don't compete aggressively enough. You don't negotiate sufficiently. You don't claim a seat at the table when you should be claiming a seat at the table. And when you do claim a seat at the table, you don't ask for enough. So the problem is you are diffident, or we are diffident. And the reason that we don't see, that we see wage gaps and that we see women not advancing enough, is because of a problem that lies within women. so they are not pushing enough. So that's one kind of advice that women are given. But they are also told that, okay, the problem is not of your own doing. There are external factors that are causing this earnings gap and wage gap. So, right, so women are taken advantage of, they're discriminated against, they're harassed, they are bullied, they are excluded from the boys' club, etc., etc. There are these famous stories of going for a game of golf with your boss early in the morning at 5:30 or something, and then you discuss very important strategy about the company over the golf game, from which the woman is necessarily excluded, or you go for a late night drink with your boss and you get excluded. If you watch the serial Ted Lasso, in one of the scenes, he gets offered a job in the urinal. Both his boss and he have gone for a leak in the urinal, and as they are taking a pee, the boss offers him something. So obviously, that is a situation a woman would never ever be able to get it. So this whole notion of it's just a boys' club and we are just comfortable with each other and etc. So women are also told that, okay, these are all very structural factors, etc., that those need to change. So it's confusing, and it's also not clear what exactly is causing, even now, labor force participation is not an issue in the US any longer. But the issues of wage gaps, earnings gaps, and career trajectories diverging, that's really the problem for college-educated women in the US. So she says all of these are important. These are real problems. Okay, but these are not the root cause of the divergence. She's coined a term called greedy work. And she says it's the existence of greedy work that is causing this divergence in female and male trajectories over time. I mean, as they advance in their careers. So the husband and the wife may be similarly educated at the point of entry, but as they advance in their careers, the trajectories start to diverge. And the cause of that is greedy work. So before we come to greedy work, let's rule out some other explanations here. So one is, let's say, occupational segregation, which is a very common explanation given also in the context of India. But think of a thought experiment. Supposing women and men are in equal proportions in the workforce, okay? And let's say 30% of women are teachers, but just 10% of the men are teachers, right? So there is an occupational difference. And supposing for engineers, the opposite is true. So teachers are female dominated and engineers are male dominated. We wave a magic wand and we take 2/3 of the teachers and we make them engineers, right? So we've eliminated the occupational segregation. The question that she's asking is, if we did that, what would be the wage gap that would get eliminated? And of course, you don't have to actually wave a magic wand. There are techniques, econometric techniques, which can develop this counterfactual and look at a counterfactual earnings distribution, right? So you can do that. Now, she says in the United States context, even if all occupations were counterfactually made 50-50 male-female, so every occupation is half men and half women, only 1/3 of the inequality in earnings will get eliminated. So 2/3 of the inequality in earnings will still remain, which is not due to occupational segregation. So, so she's done a lot of work showing that this is the case. So it's not occupational segregation, okay? And also, there's the other fact that gender earnings gaps, the reason it's also not occupational segregation is just from a simple stylized fact that within every occupation, there is an earnings gap. And the earnings gap is highest for college-educated women. So think of the kinds of work that college-educated women do, and you would think, well, in those kinds of work, you surely should not see an earnings wage gap. It would be all about, merit and ability and quality of the worker, rather than of the employee, rather than plain old-fashioned discrimination. So the highest educated population in the US has the biggest gender earnings gap. So that's what she shows. Okay. So she looks at longitudinal data, which is you follow the same cohort over time. So you're getting data on the same set of men and women over time. And as I said earlier, basically straight out of college, their wages hardly diverge. They enter college-educated populations, enter at very similar wages in jobs. Okay, the first few years, there is some divergence, but the pay gap is modest. It's not huge. Okay. After about 10 years of graduation, that's when large differences in pay become apparent, right? And what she argues, and I'm going to show this with a diagram probably in the next slide, which is that the gender earnings gap, it starts to show up 10 years after the cohort has joined a job, is a result of what she calls the career gap. And it is this career gap that, according to her, is the root of gender inequality in the United States amongst the college education population. So what is this career gap? How does this gap appear? Okay. So in 2020, for example, it's not about education again. 45% of 25-year-old women graduated from a 4-year college, only 36% of men. So actually graduation rates for women are higher. And in India also very soon that might be true, because enrollment in education is, often higher for women in some places. This wasn't always the case. So in 1960, for example, there was 1.6 males for every female. So this education gap has actually not only has it declined, it's actually in some senses reversed. Okay. And women are not only getting more educated, they are entering professional degrees in much higher proportion. So aspirations have increased. So you look at, law, MBA, PhD, MD, et cetera, et cetera. So these are really top high-paying professional degrees. And you see women entering these degrees, these educational degrees in higher proportions, whereas the male proportion has not changed in over 4 decades. They had a high proportion and they continue to do that, but female proportion in these degrees has gone up. Okay. And interestingly, also women are also, families are also having more children, right? So women are entering jobs. They think of a career which is well-paying, which is aspirational, which has avenues for mobility. But college graduated women born around early 1970s have a higher birth rate than those born around the 1950s. So that's another feature which is different from India, for example. So earlier, the choice that women used to make, her point is that in the 1950s and 60s, women made a choice between a career or a family. So you had kids if you didn't think of a career. And if you thought of a career, then you chose not to have kids or maybe have just one kid, etc. But now you see career women with 2 children or 3 children, maybe even. So women are refusing to make a choice between career and family, because the argument is, if men don't have to make this choice, why should women have to make this choice? So if we want children, we want children. And not that doesn't mean that every woman has children. That's not the point. But the point is that the cohort, the proportion of women that want both career and a family, that's increasing over time in the US. Okay, now before I come to the greedy work, it's all building up towards that. So here, this is actually a very important paper by her and Lawrence Katz, which is about the effect of the contraceptive pill that was developed in 1960, and the FDA approved it, and it was made available for general population to use. And she has analyzed data of labor force participation rates, all kinds of outcomes. And she argues that the invention of the contraceptive pill was what she calls a quiet revolution. It had revolutionary impact on American society in terms of both work as well as family. Okay. What it did was, young women now had the ability to plan their families. It was not a question of, okay, we get married and then just have children, as many children as they wanted to have. Now you found women delaying marriage, and yet think of carefully about who they wanted to marry, maybe date for a little while, etc. That it just expanded the choice horizon for women. And what that did was that in the median age at marriage in 1970 was 23. It increased to 28 in 2023. That's, by age at marriage figures, that's an enormous increase. Increase of 5 years in a period of whatever, 60 years or whatever it is. It's a phenomenal increase. When I read the paper, I was quite taken aback by this increase. So Women have better control over their fertility. Marriages are later and they are found to last longer because women are older, they're more mature when they make choices about their partners, often because they have control over their fertility. They might have dated some people earlier. So, they have a better sense of what to expect, what they're okay with and what they're not. So, so there's much more control and agency that women have in terms of their, fertility decisions, marriage decisions, etc. And that is also one of the factors that has led it to women thinking of, I really want to have careers now. I want to have a career. And by the way, there's one part of it that I haven't gone into where she analyzes the effect of legal changes in the US. So many jobs earlier had marriage bars. So if a woman was married, she was not eligible. Then when that became disallowed by law, many jobs had pregnancy bar. So if you became pregnant, you had to quit the job, etc., etc. So there were many ways to legally bar women from entering certain professions. All that has gone. And she has papers that looks at the effect of, elimination of these. So she says, now you don't have any obvious legal hurdles. I mean, nobody can either fire or refuse to hire a woman because she's married or is going to have a child or anything like that. However, what all of these changes together have done is that as aspirations for a career and for family have increased in these couples who are college educated, an important part of the career path, and now I'm coming to the greedy part, which is that work has become what she calls greedy. What that means is the person who puts in the overtime, the person who attends a late night meeting, the person who can fly at short notice, the person who is available to attend a meeting at any time, who can do a weekend trip, who can network, who's available basically to work at any time, right? That person earns more than the person who is not available to do all of these things, right? So in the recent controversy about Mr. Murthy's remarks, it's a 70-hour worker. That's the person who's going to earn more, right? And you might think that this is happening because that person is working 70 hours, whereas the woman, I mean, it need not be the man or the woman, but typically it ends up being the woman. The other person is working fewer hours. And I think the salience of Goldin's contribution is that it's not coming because of differences in hours put in. So look at this. Okay. The slide will come much later in one more time. So women are still pursuing demanding careers, okay? But one of the two, of the husband and the wife, has to be ready to be on call, has to be ready to leave office at a moment's notice, needs flexibility, because what if the child falls sick? What if the school calls to say, your child needs to be picked up? Not be expected to answer an email or a call at 10 p.m. at night, and would need to be at sports lessons, music lessons, play dates, birthday parties, school projects, etc., etc. So one of the parents has to do all of these things, right? Or has to do more of all of these things compared to the other one. The other parent will be at work and will do just the opposite. That parent will not be available for a last-minute call from your school's kids' kindergarten to just say, okay, come in, your child is sick, you need to be home, or any of these things. So the potential impact on the person who's available to do this in terms of advancement, in terms of promotions, in terms of earnings is obvious, right? There's no prizes for guessing which of these parents is going to get ahead in their career and which one is not, right? And this need not be gendered. The parent who's on the so-called mommy track could be the male. However, gender does enter into it. The mommy track parent, most of the time, happens to be the mommy, actually, the mother, okay? And here is the diagram that I was talking about. And don't get intimidated if you're not used to diagrams, but I think it's a very important one. So what you see here, the H star, are not the extra hours worked. This is the typical 40 to 45 hour weekday, okay? So think of a person, both men and women. So she calls the greedy position, which is the blue line, and the yellow shaded line is called the flexible position. So the flexible position is of the parent who's doing the mommy track. And the greedy position is the person who's always available to network, to fly out at short notice, etc. The difference in the pay of the greedy position and the flexible position at an average work week, which is 40 to 45 hours, is not occurring because the greedy position parent is working more hours. What's happening is that much before you hit 45 hours or 40 hours, you see very close to zero, the lines start to diverge. Okay, so what it means is that this person who's doing the greedy work, who's on the greedy job, that person starts to get rewarded favorably through earnings, through higher earnings. And so the per hour wage of the person on the greedy job is higher than the per hour wage of the person on the flexible track. So the person on the greedy track is not earning, and also then it's compounded with the fact that the greedy track parent is also working more. But the wage gap is not because of the hours of work. And I think that's a super important point, because usually when we talk about wage gap, everybody says, oh, but women work less because they can't, right? So the wage gap is coming because women are working less. But this shows that's not the reason, right? Now, to what extent does this translate to college-educated men and women in other countries? That data is to, we don't have data, very good data on hourly work, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a super interesting contribution, I think, of Goldin, where she talks about this divergence much before you hit the 40, 45-hour work week, that characterizes a normal work week. And then, of course, it's after that is just even greater, right? So she often asks her undergraduates, and so this, she feels, has huge implications for equality and equity between couples, between men and women who are both highly educated, right? And so she often asks her undergraduates, what do you want from your partner? And the women end up saying, various versions of this statement, which is, I want a man who wants what I want, right? And so there's a very great desire for equality, and to, say that my husband or my partner must respect my choices and allow me to do what I want. But the reality, she says, is that to maximize family income, the reality of the work, the nature of work has changed for college-educated people in the US. So to maximize family income, it makes sense for one parent to be on the greedy track and the other parent to be on the flexible track. And when that happens, gender can't be ignored, because most of the time it would be the man on the greedy track and the woman on the flexible track. So even if you started off as equal partners, you got a partner who wanted for you what you wanted, at the end, very soon, 10 years after marriage, you see this divergence. And this has come through other work from sociologists, etc., that by the time you see couples who've been married 10, 15 years, the notion of the man as far as domestic work is concerned is fixing the yard, or, doing some heavy male stuff like, oh, I clean the pipe in the car or whatever it is. But groceries, cooking, children's homework, play dates, birthday parties, etc., and emotional labor, which is sending birthday cards to relatives and things like that, organizing gifts, care, the emotional part of nurturing and care, all of that predominantly falls on the woman. And in some sense, it's quote unquote justified, saying, well, I'm the one, I'm on the greedy track and you're on the flexible track, so you should do that. And so anyway, she keeps going back and forth between the historical evidence and the contemporary evidence. So basically in 1900, very few women were in college and didn't have anything resembling a career. Even if they were working, it wasn't really a career. You went out and worked and earned some money. Now, women, by and large, have families and careers. They don't have to make that choice any longer. But gender gaps persist, not because women are not in the labor force, or not because they are not in good jobs. The jobs of themselves are pretty good. But because of the greedy track, flexible track divergence, women are not in greedy work most of the time. They are in flexible work, and men are in the greedy work. That's causing the divergence. So gender bias in earnings is an important element of workplace inequality. So this is just one thing that I want to mention. It's an older paper of hers, where she did an experiment, collaborating with symphony orchestras in New York. Earlier, the symphony orchestras, when they auditioned, when people had to audition for the orchestras, the jury could see the player. And women often wouldn't get selected for, important positions in the orchestra. She collaborated with them and started this process of blind auditions. So the players used to play their instruments behind a curtain. And when that happened, women's entry into prestigious operas started to increase. And now it's become a practice. So racial discrimination and gender discrimination, because you can't see the person. And so it's pretty standard now that for symphony orchestras, you would do a blind audition. So she understands the role of discrimination. She understands the role of de-biasing, right? But her point is that even if this was done, first, it's very hard to do it. But even if this was done, it's not going to take care of the inequality, because the root of that inequality she sees in this divergence between greedy work and flexible work. So what do we do then? So her prescription, easier said than done, is that flexible positions should be made more abundant and more productive, which means you pay more for flexible positions. So reduce the gap between the greedy positions and the flexible positions in terms of earnings. Of course, she realizes that it's very hard to do that. So that's the kind of policy question that she leaves us with. And finally, some thoughts on wider applicability of her work. One is, if you analyze the earning gaps between less educated couples, who are not in these greedy jobs at all. So what would be the primary causes there? She's done some work and she's talked about gender discrimination, but her focus has now been on college-educated women. How do these patterns differ by race, for example? That's something that would be interesting to know. Can the results be generalized to the rest of the world, to developing countries? Not necessarily, because we don't have anything resembling this rise in the age at marriage, or women thinking of. There is a section of Indian women that thinks of careers and family, but often it's a choice, but it would be interesting to actually do this greedy work, flexible work kind of distinction in the context of India. What I think her lessons are, and people have written extensively about her contributions, and many people said, oh, no, Goldin's work is not relevant because the conditions in developing countries are very different and she doesn't actually look at them. What I think is important about her work is that, she highlights the importance of changing the material conditions and showing that norms shift later, not before. And working in this field, I cannot emphasize this insight enough, because the majority of opinion on this question focuses on norms. And I really don't think that norms have never changed before material conditions. Norms are a product of some material conditions. China went from foot binding to 80% labor force participation rate. It's not as though one day people just woke up and say, oh, terrible, how terrible, we do foot binding. Let's push women into the labor force. That doesn't happen. It's all kinds of material things changed that eliminated that practice and instituted the practice of equality. Today, they are facing a crisis of very low birth rates. So now again, the Chinese Communist Party is saying women should go back into the household, think of the traditional family, etc. So as material conditions change, norms start to shift. So I think that there's a big lesson to be learned from Goldin's work, and also some of this analysis may be replicable for countries like India. And I think we should, researchers should consider, doing whatever can be replicated. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ashwini. We have time for questions, so we can first take questions from the hall. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question?
Hi, thank you so much. Really great talk. I have two unrelated questions, so maybe I'll just ask one. First, in terms of these kinds of flexible positions, or like a kind of structural changing the system approach, I think countries like Sweden, for example, have tried some of this in terms of instituting parental leave or such policies. I was wondering if you had any insight into whether that has worked to somehow reduce this wage gap.
So in Scandinavia, in general, wage gaps are lower than in the rest of the world. So in terms of gender equality indicators, the Scandinavian countries do the best. However, you know about the recent strike in Iceland, right? where all women went on strike for a day and they said, we're not going to do any domestic work. So the point is that when you think of domestic chores and you think of childcare and, cleaning and cooking, etc., it pretty much everywhere in the world, it is seen predominantly as a woman's responsibility. So if the man helps, it's seen as, oh my God, it's so wonderful that, the man is helping. In India, that norm is terrible, by the way. So when I say norms, there are differences in norms, and India and South Asia in particular have the worst norms in terms of sharing of domestic chores. And I guess Scandinavia would have the best norms. The research on parental leave is mixed. So there are papers that look at academics who get an extra year for tenure track. If they're on tenure track, they get an extra year if they've had a child. And what people have seen is that the male, the father, and the new father ends up publishing more during the extra year. And the woman often needs to ask for even more time because the man thinks of that extra year, oh, great, now I have more time to do my research. And you see other examples as well of parental leave, where it's not as though men don't take parental leave when it's available, but what do they do during the parental leave? That's the question. Do they fully take charge in a way that the mother would do when she's on maternity leave? And the evidence on that is not so obvious. So yeah, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be. Of course there should be. And the message that it's the duty of both parents to take care of the child must go out. But you need more than that. I mean, I'm saying it's necessary, but not sufficient.
Thank you. I had a question about one of the things that women proportions in PhD increased, but men's did not change over the last 4 decades.
Not just PhD, all the professional courses. Yeah.
So is it because that men already had a higher, so because it did not increase further?
They already had a high proportion and that it stayed that way. But women who didn't have a high proportion of professional degrees, really increased in the last. So basically, if you see her story, 1950s married women enter the labor force in a big way. So that's the one thing. And then 60s is the pill. So between the aftermath of the Second World War and the pill, that's really what caused a huge amount of very important shifts in the US structure of family and society.
Also, my second question is, does per hour wage increase or hours increase? Like, what is the reason? Like the per hour wage is increasing or the hours the greedy work is increasing?
Per hour wage starts to diverge much before you even hit the regular work week of 40 hours a week.
So is this also reflected in the positions which the greedy?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. You get promoted more quickly and you just, so it's not about hours worked, it's about where you are in the company.
Hello. Thank you, Professor, for such a nice lecture. I had 2 questions. First is that are there any Indian organizations which are doing a similar research which Professor Claudia has done, or something which we can refer to in an Indian context? And the second question is that what is the impact of technology? I think that has not been covered in a study, I guess, or maybe not.
Impact of technology
on the wage gap.
On the wage gap?
Yeah, because with the advent of technology, internet and service sector growing as it was shown.
In the US or in India?
Since it's on US, then Indian context, that's what the first question is.
Okay, so the first there is a whole, there's a very large number of researchers that are looking at all of these questions, including in Ashoka. So, there's a large number of me and my colleagues who work on issues of female labor force participation, gender wage gaps, all kinds of things. So there's us, but there's also many other people. So the research on women's conditions or male-female gaps is massive in India. There's a lot of work out there. So that's one thing. The exact replica of this work has not been done. Like, if you're asking me whether this greedy work, flexible work has been done in the case of India, no. Because I think in India, we have a prior problem of labor force participation rates to begin with. Women have to be in the workforce. So a lot of the preconditions that she talks about, we don't have in India, right? Because we don't see women in those large numbers in
participation in higher education is also
Is
there is a
it-
gap.
no.
Yeah, school dropout and
not so significant any longer. So the male-female gaps in education in India are rapidly declining. It's pretty impressive actually how fast they are declining. So that's not the reason, but entry into the labor force is an issue. Anyway, I can talk about it for several hours, so I won't. But what was your second question?
impact of technology.
So technology, she talks earlier, not about the greedy work, but impact of technology will happen. The way it happened was it allowed more women to enter the labor force because work no longer required only manual strength. Women became educated, you could use technology, you could use computers, whatever it might be. And so that facilitated entry of women into the labor force.
I think we'll go with your question and then we'll shift to some of the online questions that have come. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. I have two questions. One is related to the lower labor force participation that you just mentioned. What is stopping women from entering the labor force
We are
participation?
to India now?
Huh? Yeah.
Okay. How much time have you got? Okay, so to give a one-line answer, and as you must have guessed, my views on this question and my research on the analysis of this question is a little bit different from the mainstream understanding. So the mainstream understanding is social norms. My work shows that it's a problem for demand, which is particularly greater for women. So overall, the growth in the working age population in India far exceeds the availability of jobs for these people. So there's a widening gulf between the number of people who are seeking work and the work that is available, which is productive work, right? So that's the one problem. And as that gap is increasing within that, so youth unemployment is really high in India. In that, women are disproportionately the victims of that situation, in the sense that women are less likely to get work. Women are also less likely to declare themselves unemployed openly. So what happens is when labor markets are tight or there's no work available, women will not say, I'm looking for work and not getting it. You just say, okay, I'm not working. That's it. So my analysis of the situation is, you can call it the demand side story. So it's labor demand. It's demand for labor. That's the problem, in my view.
And my second, can I ask my second? My second question is like, what changes in what changes do we need to bring in like the working environment so that so that we bridge this wage gap?
This is about the US. The wage gap that we talked about right now is about the US.
Right.
So you're asking what she says about the US?
Yeah, like what do we need?
So her prescription is that make flexible work more remunerative, pay more for flexible work, and make flexible work the more common mode of working. So basically, don't make greedy work the typical work in which, so if you're working in a very highly competitive professional environment, don't venerate greedy work. That, that person can answer an email at 11 o'clock. Even if he's sitting on the beach, he has his laptop answering emails. That's not something to be venerated and rewarded. So her point is, make flexible work the norm rather than the lesser paying track. That's her prescription for the US.
Thank you.
I think Mihir has a question. Yeah, Mihir, please.
So do we know for the data whether for those companies which allow work from home or more flexible work hours, is the gender bias or inequality less? Or
in the US?
Yeah.
No, she says no. Because even if you're working from home, the fact is you're on call as far as work is concerned. So even if you're working from home, you're constantly sitting in Zoom meetings or whatever it might be, etc. And it's that ability to be available on call, that's what pays more. That's her analysis. Right? And so you might be actually working more hours or not, but the fact that you are actually available to do that work, that's why the gap starts kicking in much before the 45 hour typical work week that you have. It kicks in at, say, 15 hours even, because then you start being considered a more important asset to the company. And so even if you put in 1 hour on the Zoom meeting, you're going to be rewarded differently than.
So companies can differentiate whether the person is available on call or.
They will have different designations. Not that each.
The designation.
So you basically get fast tracked into a higher designation, you become the manager more quickly. you become the decision maker more quickly. So if there's a small team that needs to decide on something quickly, you will get called in as opposed to your wife in her company, right? And so it's not as though you are measuring hours of work. It's just that you get caught up on this track, which is decision making, it's leadership, and therefore on that track you get paid more.
Just take a few questions from the online component. Will you read them out?
So, ma'am, Gurnoor is asking, what are some of the ways to which material conditions can change to enable career feminism? Who has the power to create these material conditions and who is lobbying against them?
In India?
Gurnoor, whether your question is in relation to the US or India? In US.
Oh, I mean, that's just the way corporations and higher pay, highly rewarding workplaces, that's the way they're organized. And her point is that needs to change to make flexible work more the norm, and flexible work should be paid more. That's her point. That has not happened yet, and she doesn't have any easy prescriptions for that. But that's the point that she's making.
Vinod has a question. It seems like economics Nobel Committee is recognizing winners also for their methodological innovations, example Duflo Banerjee, with use of RCTs at field level. Could you say something about Goldin's methodological approaches, which seem more sociological?
No, it seems more sociological, but there's enormous amounts of data work. I just presented it this way to make it more accessible because I knew it would be a mixed audience. She has tremendous amounts of data work. She's looked at data for 200 years, as dug out historical records. So her work is very solid, Just because I used English words here doesn't mean that she didn't use data and was not rigorous enough, right? Methodological innovations, well, the biggest thing is looking at a longer lens of history. The longer arc of historical, the historical view, that's what has provided a lot of these insights, which would not have happened if she had looked at a shorter period, So the idea that you can integrate economic history into uncovering patterns that you normally would not be able to uncover, I think that's her contribution.
Gurnoor has a second question. Are there reasons for believing that working from home as an alternative to traditional in-office work would allow for some of the flexible worker demographic to shift to greedy worker position? In fact, what equilibrium do industries prefer for greedy is to flexible workers as employees? I'm guessing there is some stable ratio because otherwise there won't be any flexible workers to exploit and too many workaholics to pay more.
No, I mean, the fact is that society as a whole needs children because that's the next generation of the labor force, right? So in fact, the concern that I said about China is precisely because where is the next generation of workers going to come from, right? That's what they're worried about now. Several European countries often offer incentives to couples to have more children because they're worried about, falling birth rates, precisely because workplaces are very harsh towards people who have children because you are not able to manage. So it's not true to say that the desired effect is that nobody should have children, everybody should be a workaholic. The point is, okay, one of you can take care of the children, but the other one, can be at office. And any organization needs a whole distribution of workers. Like everybody is not a manager, everybody is not a CEO, everybody is not in the board of directors. You need all kinds of positions. And the positions that allow flexible work are necessarily the lower paying ones. Work from home, again, in countries like India, very few kinds of jobs can actually be done from home. 90% of our labor force is in the informal sector. They can't work. So, we can talk about work from home about one segment of the population, but that's a very small segment of the population. So, yeah, it's complicated.
Let's just take the last question from there and then we'll finish up.
In the US, in the US, is there any research to show for whether that the differentiation between greedy track, mommy track is change at all for same-sex couples where both partners are working women?
Good question. And you don't see this kind of a gap according to her, in same-sex couples. It's
Like,
in heterosexual couples.
Sorry, has she shown is there evidence for that also?
She shows evidence for that. That you see this problem in heterosexual couples.
Okay, we'll take a last question from there.
And also, by the way, another very nice graph, which I didn't show, is that she looks at only MBAs, only one career, and she looks at MBA women with children and MBA women without children. And this divergence happens only for MBA women with children. So it's really the demands of childcare. That's what is producing this. So when they don't have children, women can also be on the greedy track. So yeah.
Thank you for the lecture, Professor. I had one question. So I read a case study a while back where it stated that with the increase in laws like maternity leaves and paternal leaves, employers were actually less willing to hire female workers after the implementation of such laws because they did not want a majority of their workforce or a whole part of their workforce to take leaves if they were planning to have a child. So they actually started preferring male workers after laws like maternity leaves came into place. So how does that work counterintuitively, right? So how does one go about tackling that issue?
There is an argument that people make, and it's not an illegitimate concern, that employers will just, if you have too many pro-women policies, employer will just shift to men, right? And in countries like India, it can happen because there's such a large pool of workers who are unemployed. So, you'll always get enough men to do the work. And so that's sort of a backlash kind of an effect, right? And many progressive policies can have a backlash. So, for example, there's evidence to show that when women were allowed as property holders, when the Hindu Succession Act changed, violence against women increased because the men in their families didn't want women to inherit the property. So murders, etc., or suspicious deaths of women increased. So therefore, should the law not have been made? Of course not. So when you realize a particular mindset that is going to create a backlash, then you have to say, okay, what else needs to be done in order to make sure that this law is implemented? By the way, US has one of the worst maternity leave regimes. So part of the reason that this happens in the US is because many companies don't give any maternity leave. Many companies insurance will not cover maternity costs unless it's classified as an illness. So many women report when they go on maternity, they say they are ill, and that's when they get insurance. So the US work system actually is is in this respect very regressive, and that's the reason why you may not find the exact same thing in other countries.
Let me thank Ashwini for a wonderful talk. I learned a lot. I think there's tea outside, so more questions can be asked. I'm sure Ashwini will have a few minutes outside to deal with them.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks. I'm leaving. Okay. It'll get. It was recorded, right, Sonal? Hello.